There are rooms in your life you do not know you are entering until the door has closed quietly behind you. They are not rooms of wood and plaster, but of feeling, spaces built from silence and proximity, whose architecture is defined by the subtle shift of a body on a couch or the weight of a head resting on a shoulder. You can live in these rooms for months, years even, learning the specific slant of light that falls through their invisible windows, memorizing the particular way the air stills when another person is near. You become a student of their unique atmosphere, a cartographer of their emotional geography. And the whole time, you might be telling yourself that you are merely a visitor, a guest in a temporary space, until a moment arrives, unannounced, that locks the door from the inside. A moment that makes you realize you have not been visiting at all. You have been building a home. For me, that moment smelled of laundry detergent, cheap pizza, and the faint, clean scent of the shampoo Julian used. It was the moment I understood that the most significant space I had ever occupied was the 6 inches of worn-out sofa cushion between my body and his. He was asleep. That was the first, most critical fact of the situation, the one I clung to like a raft in a vast and uncertain ocean. Julian was asleep, his head pillowed on my chest, the steady, rhythmic puff of his breath a warm ghost against the collar of my t-shirt. His arm was draped loosely across my stomach, his fingers curled just shy of my hip bone. One of his long legs was bent, his knee nudging my thigh, a point of contact that seemed to hum with a low, dangerous electricity. From this vantage point, I could see the soft, dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek, the slight parting of his lips, the way a single lock of dark brown hair had fallen across his forehead. He looked younger in sleep, the sharp angles of his waking face softened, the relentless energy that usually radiated from him banked into a quiet, peaceful glow. He was a city with its lights turned off, and I was the lone watchman on a high tower, witnessing a stillness no one else was ever permitted to see. And it was, without question, the most terrifying and beautiful thing I had ever experienced. This had become our ritual, an unspoken agreement that had taken root in the barren soil of his recovery. It had started weeks ago, after the accident. A dislocated shoulder, the doctors had said. A severe one. For a swimmer of Julian's caliber, a swimmer who was supposed to be the anchor of the university's relay team, it was a sentence handed down without a trial. His world, once a predictable series of clean lines, the black stripes on the bottom of the pool, the edge of the starting block, the lane ropes that kept everyone in their place, had dissolved into a murky, formless chaos. The friends who had once orbited him like eager planets, drawn in by the gravity of his easy charm and athletic prowess, had slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with the new, somber satellite that had taken his place. They didn't know how to talk to the Julian who couldn't lift his arm to put on a shirt, the Julian who winced when he laughed too hard, the Julian who stared at the ceiling of his dorm room for hours, the future he had mapped out for himself now a tattered, unreliable document. But I knew how to be quiet with him. I had always been quiet. It was my native language. I was Mark's younger brother, the art student with the camera perpetually hanging from his neck, the observer who came for visits and mostly just faded into the floral print armchair that smelled faintly of stale beer and old books. Mark was my tether to this place, to this loud, boisterous apartment he shared with Julian. But Julian was the reason I kept coming back, long after the obligation of a sibling visit had been fulfilled. I had been quietly, hopelessly in love with him since the first day Mark had introduced us, a fact I had packed away into a small, dark box in the deepest corner of my heart, a place I never intended to visit. To me, he was a masterpiece of light and form, all bright smiles and easy confidence, a subject I could only ever dare to capture from a distance, an anonymous figure in the background of a photograph, forever out of focus. So when his world went quiet, I simply joined him in the silence. I would come over, ostensibly to see Mark, and I would find Julian on the couch, his arm in a navy blue sling, a fortress of pillows built around him. Mark would eventually leave, off to a class or the library or a party, clapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Keep an eye on the patient for me, Leo," and the apartment would shrink, the ambient noise fading until the only sounds were the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the soft rustle of our clothes. We'd watch movies, terrible action films, and mindless comedies he'd choose, and at some point, he would shift uncomfortably. The first time, he had hesitated, his brow furrowed with a mixture of pain and embarrassment. "Hey," he'd said, his voice low. Would it be weird if I just leaned on you? This sling makes every position impossible." I remember my heart doing a slow, painful somersault in my chest. I had managed a nod, my throat too tight for words. And so he had. He had carefully, tentatively, rested his head on my shoulder. The contact was electric, a lightning strike that traveled from that single point of pressure all the way down to my toes. I had sat there, ramrod straight, my muscles screaming in protest, terrified that if I so much as breathed too deeply, I would break the spell. He had sighed, a soft, weary sound, and for the first time in weeks, the tight lines of pain around his eyes had relaxed. We finished the movie like that, in a silence that was heavier and more charged than any conversation we'd ever had. When the credits rolled, he didn't move. I thought he'd fallen asleep. After 20 minutes of agonizing stillness, I had dared to whisper his name. "I'm awake," he'd murmured back, his voice thick with something I couldn't decipher. "This is just nice. It's the first time my shoulder hasn't been throbbing all day." That was how the ritual began. It was our plausible deniability. It was for his shoulder. It was a practical matter of physics and comfort, a solution to a medical problem. It was anything and everything other than what my heart screamed it was, a lifeline. For both of us. The next time I visited, he didn't even ask. As soon as Mark left, he just shifted closer, his eyes on the television screen, and settled against me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His body, which had once seemed like a monument of athletic perfection, now felt fragile and achingly human against my own. I was no longer just Mark's quiet brother. I was a piece of architecture, a support beam, a harbor wall against which his tired, battered ship could rest. And I was so terrified of him discovering the truth of my feelings that I became the most convincing actor, playing the part of the stoic, unbothered friend, a solid, unmovable object. Inside, however, a storm was raging. Every visit was a tightrope walk over a canyon of yearning. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the ritual had deepened. He had started on my shoulder as usual, but as the movie droned on, he had slid down, his movements slow and drugged with exhaustion, until his head was in my lap. And then, after another hour, he had shifted again, uncurling his long frame until he was stretched out beside me, his head finding its current resting place on my chest. He had done it all in his sleep, or a state so close to it that it didn't matter. There was no pretense left, no geometry of comfort for his shoulder to explain this. This was not about an injury. This was something else. This was a form of trust so profound it made my breath catch in my throat. He had sought me out in his unconsciousness, instinctively finding the safest harbor he knew. I was trapped, pinned by the weight of his sleeping body and the even heavier weight of my own secret. My hand, which had been resting on the cushion beside his head, felt like a useless, foreign object. I wanted, more than I had ever wanted anything, to lift it, to gently brush that stray lock of hair from his forehead, to trace the line of his jaw. It would be such a small movement, a gesture that would take less than a second. But it felt like a monumental transgression, a crossing of a boundary so sacred and fragile that the mere thought of it was a kind of sacrilege. To him, this was comfort. This was safety. If he knew that for me, it was a slow, sweet agony of hope and desire. He would bolt. The trust would shatter, and this quiet, fragile room we had built would collapse into dust around us. So I kept my hands to myself. I counted his breaths. I watched the way the blue light from the television screen flickered across his face, turning his skin into a landscape of shifting shadows. I stayed perfectly, excruciatingly still, a living statue providing sanctuary to the one person who could destroy me with a single word. To understand the precariousness of that moment, you have to understand the geography of our friendship before the fall. I met Julian during the first week of my freshman year. dragged along by my older brother, Mark, to his new off-campus apartment. Mark was a force of nature, all loud laughter and backslapping camaraderie. He collected friends like some people collected stamps, and Julian was his prized acquisition. They were both on the swim team, two sides of the same golden boy coin. Mark was the cheerful, steady workhorse. Julian was the prodigy, the one with the raw, breathtaking talent that made coaches speak his name with a kind of reverence. When I walked into their apartment for the first time, Julian was standing in the kitchen, dripping water onto the linoleum floor, a towel slung low on his hips, laughing at something one of his teammates had said. He was all sleek muscle and sun-kissed skin, and his smile was so bright it felt like it could power the entire city. My first thought was, oh. It was not a thought of the mind, but of the body, a sudden, quiet recognition, like the hum of a tuning fork struck against my own bones. He turned, and that brilliant smile landed on me. "You must be Leo," he said, his voice warm and easy. He didn't offer to shake my hand, seeing as he was half naked and wet, but he gave me a small nod. "Mark talks about you all the time. The genius photographer." I remember flushing, mumbling something incoherent about just taking pictures for the school paper. I was used to being invisible, especially around people like Julian, people who seemed to burn so brightly they cast everyone else into shadow. But he had this way of looking at you, a focused, genuine interest that made you feel seen. For the rest of that first year, that was the shape of our interactions. I would visit Mark, and Julian would be there, a constant, radiant presence in the background of my life. He was never anything but kind to me. He'd ask about my classes, look at my photos with sincere curiosity, and always make sure I had a drink in my hand at their crowded, noisy parties, even though he knew I'd just nursed the same beer for 3 hours in a corner. He treated me like a person, not just as his roommate's awkward younger brother. And for that, I adored him with a fierce, secret loyalty that felt almost painful in its intensity. I became a student of Julian. I learned the way his mood could be read by the set of his shoulders after a hard practice. I learned that he hated almonds but loved pistachios, that he listened to sad, ambient music when he was studying, a stark contrast to his public persona. I learned that for all his social grace, he sometimes had a look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. A flicker of loneliness, of some deep, unnameable exhaustion. It was a look I recognized because I saw it in the mirror every morning. It was a crack in the perfect marble facade, and it was through that tiny crack that my crush metastasized into something deeper, something more complex and dangerous. I saw a hint of his hidden room, and I felt an inexplicable pull to know what was inside. My camera became my shield and my confessional. I took hundreds of photos of him, none of them overt. He was always on the edge of the frame, a profile caught in late afternoon light, a silhouette against a window, the back of his head as he watched TV. It was a coward's art. I was documenting my own longing, capturing the object of my affection without ever having to risk declaring it. My darkroom was my sanctuary, the chemical baths like holy water. There, under the safe, red glow of the safe light, I could watch his image slowly emerge on the paper, a ghost materializing from the ether. I could look at him for as long as I wanted, unafraid of his gaze meeting mine. In my photographs, he was mine to study, to understand, to love without consequence. The prints were stacked in a box under my bed, a secret history of an unrequited love, a love I was certain would remain a silent, one-sided conversation for the rest of my life. I was content with that. Or rather, I had convinced myself I was. To be the quiet observer in his orbit was more than I had ever expected, and I was terrified of doing anything that might cause me to be ejected from it. Then came the injury. It happened during a meet, a freak accident. A slip on the wet tiles after his final turn. He'd reached out to break his fall, and his shoulder had paid the price. Mark had called me from the hospital, his voice tight with a stress I'd never heard before. The news filtered through the campus like a shockwave. Julian, the untouchable, was broken. When I saw him for the first time after he was released, propped up on that sofa, his face pale and etched with pain, the vibrant light I had always associated with him was gone. It was like seeing a cathedral after a fire. The grand structure still standing, but the stained glass windows shattered, leaving only empty, hollow spaces. That was the catalyst. That was the shift in our tectonic plates. His injury created a vacuum. His loud, fair-weather friends, the ones who thrived on his energy, didn't know how to exist in the sudden stillness. They came in flocks at first, bearing balloons and bad jokes, but their visits grew shorter, less frequent. They couldn't handle the quiet, the pain, the sheer, unglamorous boredom of his recovery. His loneliness became a palpable thing, an extra piece of furniture in the cluttered apartment. He tried to hide it, of course. He'd joke about his new accessory. Gesturing with his good arm to the sling, he'd insist he was fine, that he was enjoying the time off from 5 in the morning practices. But I could see the truth in the shadows under his eyes, in the way he'd stare into the middle distance when he thought I wasn't looking. The vibrant, confident boy I had photographed from afar was gone, and in his place was someone lost and fragile and achingly real. And so I stayed. I started visiting more often, using Mark as my excuse, but we both knew I was there for Julian. I would bring him books I thought he might like, make him tea, or just sit with him while he watched hours of mindless television. I didn't try to cheer him up. I didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. I simply offered my presence, a quiet, constant variable in his chaotic new equation. I think, in a way, he was grateful that I didn't treat him like a patient or a tragedy. I just treated him like Julian. And in that shared silence, something began to change. He started talking to me, really talking. He told me about the pressure he felt, the fear that he would never swim the same way again, that his scholarship, his entire future, was balanced on the head of a pin. He confessed his frustration with his friends, the sting of their casual abandonment. He peeled back the layers of his own persona and showed me the complicated, messy, and beautiful machinery underneath. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that the first real shift in our physical dynamic occurred. He was trying to open a jar of pickles, a ridiculous, mundane struggle. He was using his good hand and trying to brace the jar against his body, his face tight with frustration. After a moment of watching him grunt and fail, I reached out without thinking. "Here," I said softly. "Let me." I took the jar from him, my fingers brushing his, and the contact was like a static shock. I opened it easily and handed it back. He looked at my hands, then up at my face, and there was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. It was a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I hate this. I hate needing help. It's not a weakness to need help." I'd replied, my own voice just as quiet. "It's just a thing that's happening right now. It's temporary." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I felt that invisible room begin to construct itself around us. The air grew thick and still. It was after that day that he asked if he could lean on me for the first time. He had framed it as a necessity, a matter of comfort for his shoulder, and I had accepted that premise because it was the only way I could allow myself to have what I so desperately wanted. It was our alibi, our shared, unspoken fiction. It was for the injury. It had nothing to do with the fact that his loneliness was a cavernous, echoing space, and my quiet presence was the only thing that seemed to fill it. It had nothing to do with the fact that my own solitude felt less like a burden when he was near. It was just about the shoulder. We were two expert liars, telling the same lie to ourselves and to each other, with every shared silence, with every inch of decreasing distance between us on that worn-out couch. And so the ritual was born, and with it, a new chapter of my secret life began. The chapter where I was no longer just the observer, but an active participant in a delicate, terrifying dance. Each visit was a lesson in restraint. The couch became my testing ground, a laboratory for my own self-control. I learned the exact weight of his head on my shoulder, the texture of his worn university sweatshirt against my cheek. I memorized the rhythm of his breathing as it deepened into sleep, a slow, steady tide pulling him away from the shore of his anxieties. I could have sketched the whirl of his hair at the crown of his head from memory. These details became my rosary beads, tiny, sacred things I would turn over and over in my mind during the long hours I spent alone in my own quiet room. The progression was so gradual, so subtle, that I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. First, it was just his head on my shoulder. Then, his arm would come to rest against my side. A few weeks later, his hand would find its way to the cushion next to my leg, his pinky finger sometimes brushing against my jeans, a touch so light it was barely there, yet it sent a cascade of fire through my veins. He never acknowledged these small escalations, and neither did I. We orbited each other in a careful, silent gravity, both pretending not to feel the pull. His plausible deniability was his injury. Mine was my role as the helpful, stoic friend. We were safe inside our shared fiction, but the fiction was beginning to fray at the edges. There was a Tuesday I remember with painful clarity. It was raining outside, a miserable, gray drizzle that matched the mood inside the apartment. Julian was having a bad day. He'd had a physical therapy appointment that morning that had left him in more pain than usual, and the frustration was radiating off him in waves. He was quiet, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the television but seeing nothing. When he finally settled against me, it was not with his usual, slow surrender. It was a collapse. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his body tense and rigid. I could feel the tremors of his suppressed anger, the shudders of his despair. And then, I felt something wet and warm soak through the collar of my shirt. He was crying. Silently. A quiet, desperate weeping that he was trying to hide from me, and perhaps from himself. Every instinct in me screamed to wrap my arms around him, to hold him, to tell him it would be okay. But I was paralyzed by the fear of overstepping, of shattering the delicate trust he had placed in me. To acknowledge his tears would be to acknowledge the depth of the intimacy we were sharing, and that was a line I was too terrified to cross. So I did the only thing I could. I remained absolutely still. I became an anchor in his storm, a silent, unmoving witness to his grief. I let him cry until the tremors subsided, until his breathing evened out into the slow, familiar rhythm of sleep. I did not move for 2 hours. My muscles ached, my leg fell asleep, but I did not move. When he finally stirred, he pulled back slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and puffy. He wouldn't look at me. He just mumbled something about being tired, pushed himself off the couch, and retreated to his bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't mention it the next time I saw him. We fell back into our routine as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. A wall had come down. He had shown me his most vulnerable self, and I had not run away. I had stayed. After that day, the pretense of his injury began to feel thinner, more transparent. The way he sought me out felt less about physical support and more about a deeper, emotional need. He was a drowning man, and I was the only solid ground in sight. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but it was a burden I was willing to carry, even if it meant my own heart was being crushed beneath it. Which brought me back to tonight, back to this moment, with him asleep on my chest, the lines of our separate bodies blurred into a single, complicated shape in the dim light. Mark was away for the weekend, visiting his girlfriend at her university. It was the first time Julian and I had been truly alone in the apartment overnight. The silence was different, deeper. The space felt both larger and more intimate without my brother's boisterous energy to fill it. We had ordered pizza and started a movie, and the slide into our usual arrangement had been seamless, inevitable. But this time, as he drifted off, there was no pretense, no awkward shifting to find a comfortable position for his shoulder. He had simply curled into me, as if he were coming home. The weight of his trust was a physical thing, a warmth that spread through my chest and settled deep in my bones. It was a profound honor and a profound torture. To be this close to everything you have ever wanted, and to know that you cannot have it, is a special kind of hell. I was the curator of a museum dedicated to a single, priceless artifact, an artifact I was forbidden to touch. I could only watch and wonder, and ache with a longing so intense it felt like a physical pain. The movie had ended an hour ago, the screen now a blank, black mirror reflecting the quiet tableau of the room. The only light came from the dim lamp in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I knew I should move. I should gently wake him, tell him to go to his own bed. It was the sensible thing to do, the friend thing to do. But I couldn't. I was held captive by the simple, devastating fact of his proximity. To move would be to end this, to break the spell, to reopen the distance between us that, for these few precious hours, had ceased to exist. So I stayed. I let the minutes stretch into an hour, and then another. I let myself believe, just for a little while, that this quiet, shadowed room was real, and that I was allowed to live in it. I let myself pretend that I was not just a temporary harbor, but a destination. It was a dangerous, foolish fantasy, but in the dead of night, with his heart beating steadily against my ribs, it was the only thing that felt true. A sound from the hallway, the creak of a floorboard in the apartment upstairs, startled me from my reverie. Julian stirred, a soft mumble escaping his lips. His fingers, which had been resting loosely on my stomach, tightened their grip on my shirt, a small, unconscious act of possession. He burrowed his face deeper into my chest, seeking warmth, seeking comfort. My heart, which had been beating a slow, steady rhythm, began to hammer against my ribs. He was waking up. The spell was about to break. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable moment of realization, the awkward pulling away, the sheepish apology. I braced myself for the return of the distance, the rebuilding of the walls. But it didn't come. He shifted, lifting his head slowly. His eyes were bleary with sleep, his hair a mess. He blinked a few times, getting his bearings. His gaze met mine, and in the dim light, his eyes were dark, fathomless pools. I saw confusion there, but there was no panic, no immediate recoil. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thin and taut, a wire vibrating with unspoken questions. Leo. His voice was a low rasp, thick with sleep. My own voice felt trapped in my throat. I managed a single, quiet syllable. Yeah. He didn't move away. If anything, he leaned in slightly closer, his breath warm against my chin. He was studying my face, his gaze intense, searching for something. I felt utterly exposed, as if he could see straight through my carefully constructed facade and into the frantic, hopeful, terrified mess of my heart. This was it, the moment of truth, the end of our fragile fiction. Is this okay? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with 100 different meanings. Is it okay that I fell asleep on you? Is it okay that I'm this close? Is it okay that this feels like more than just friendship? I didn't know which question he was asking, but I knew my answer to all of them was the same. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. My heart was a wild bird beating its wings against the cage of my ribs, desperate for flight. A long moment passed. He searched my eyes, and whatever he found there seemed to give him courage. A flicker of something new appeared in his expression, something tentative and vulnerable and overwhelmingly brave. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if steeling himself for a dive from the highest board. Would it be weird, he started, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it, if I kissed you? The world stopped. The humming of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the very beat of my own heart. It all ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging in the space between our lips, a terrifying and beautiful possibility. He had just handed me a key to a door I never believed would even have a lock. All I had to do was turn it. But my hand was shaking. What if I was wrong? What if this was a mistake born of his loneliness and my proximity? What if opening this door meant destroying the only room where I had ever truly felt at home? The fear was a cold, sharp thing in my chest. But beneath the fear was a current of hope, powerful and undeniable, that had been running silently beneath the surface for years. It was the hope that I was not just a harbor, not just a support beam, but something more. I didn't trust my voice. So instead of speaking, I lifted my hand, the one that had been pinned beneath him, the one I had longed to move for hours. I brought it up slowly, tentatively, and cupped the side of his face. His skin was warm, a faint stubble scratching against my palm. He leaned into my touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and his eyes fluttered shut. And that was my answer. That was all the answer he needed. He closed the remaining distance between us. The kiss was not what I had expected. It was not passionate or demanding. It was a question asked in a different language. It was hesitant, soft, a gentle pressing of his lips against mine. It was achingly tender. It was a confession. It tasted of salt and sleep and a vulnerability so profound it made my chest ache. I responded with my own silent confession, a kiss that said, "I have been waiting for this my entire life. I was so afraid this would never happen. Please don't let this be a dream." It lasted only a few seconds, but it was a tectonic event, shifting the entire landscape of my world on its axis. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. His forehead rested against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. His eyes were still closed. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Okay." He didn't say anything else. He just shifted, settling back down, his head finding its place not on my chest this time, but in the curve of my shoulder. His face turned into my neck. His arm came around my waist, holding me with a new, quiet intentionality. It was not the unconscious seeking of a sleeping man. This was a choice. This was a statement. He was staying. I finally let my own arm come to rest around his shoulders, holding him close, my hand splayed across his back. The museum piece was in my arms, and I was not just allowed to touch it. I was being held back by it. We lay there for a long time, wrapped in a new kind of silence, a silence that was not about hiding, but about discovery. The door to the room had not just closed, it had been locked. And for the first time, I realized we were both on the same side of it. I fell asleep like that, holding him, the scent of his hair in my lungs, the ghost of his kiss on my lips, feeling more at home than I had ever felt in my life. The morning light was a thief. It crept through the cheap blinds, slicing the comfortable darkness into pale, gray ribbons, and stole the magic of the night. I woke first, disoriented. For a blissful, unthinking moment, I was aware only of the warmth and weight beside me. Julian was still there, his breathing deep and even, his arms still securely around my waist. The memory of the kiss returned, not as a dream, but as a vibrant, living thing, and a slow, cautious joy began to bloom in my chest. I had not imagined it. It was real. But as the room grew brighter, so did my anxiety. What now? What did this mean? Was this a beginning, or was it a beautiful, singular event, a comet that had streaked across my sky, never to be seen again? I must have shifted because Julian began to stir. He groaned softly, his grip on my waist tightening for a moment before relaxing. He pulled back, stretching his good arm over his head, his eyes still closed. Then he opened them. He blinked, focusing on the ceiling, and then his gaze drifted to me. For a second, just a second, I saw the same soft vulnerability from the night before. And then it was gone. A shutter slammed down, his expression becoming guarded, unreadable. He sat up abruptly, pulling away from me so quickly that I felt a physical sense of loss, a sudden coldness where his warmth had been. "Hey," he said, his voice strained, unnaturally bright. "Morning. Man, I must have passed out hard." He ran a hand through his already messy hair, refusing to meet my eyes. He was looking everywhere but at me, at the television, at the pizza box on the floor, at the window. He was creating distance, not just physically, but emotionally, building a wall brick by invisible brick. "Julian," I started, my voice quiet. "I should probably, get some coffee going," he said, cutting me off. He stood up, his movements stiff and awkward. "You want some?" He was already moving towards the kitchen, his back to me. The question was a formality, a desperate attempt to steer us back into the safe, shallow waters of our old dynamic. He was pretending. He was pretending that last night, that kiss, had never happened. And with every word he spoke, a cold, sickening dread began to pool in my stomach. I had misread everything. It had been a mistake. A moment of lonely, late-night confusion on his part that he now deeply regretted. The beautiful room we had built was being dismantled before my eyes. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Julian became a ghost in his own apartment. He was polite, but distant. The easy camaraderie we had developed was gone, replaced by a stilted, awkward tension. He found excuses to be busy. He had to study. He had to call his parents. He had a physical therapy appointment he'd forgotten about. He would leave the room when I came over to see Mark. The couch, our sacred space, became a no-man's land. He never sat on it when I was there. He would perch on the arm of the floral armchair or lean against the kitchen counter, always maintaining a safe, uncrossable distance. He wouldn't meet my gaze for more than a second. It was a masterful campaign of avoidance, and it was breaking my heart into 1,000 tiny pieces. The silence between us was no longer the comfortable, intimate silence of shared space. It was a loud, roaring silence, filled with the unspoken words of his regret and my confusion. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it from every angle, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I been too eager? Had I pushed him? No, he had initiated it. He had asked. But the memory, once so warm and certain, was now tainted with doubt. Maybe he had just been half asleep. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I had built an entire cathedral of meaning out of a single, meaningless brick. The self-recrimination was relentless. I had been a fool to think someone like Julian could ever want someone like me. I was the quiet, awkward art student. He was the golden boy, the swimming star. I was a footnote in his story, and I had foolishly tried to write myself into the main text. Now, I had not only failed, but I had ruined the one thing I couldn't bear to lose. Our friendship. The quiet sanctuary we had shared was gone, and I had been the one to burn it down. After a week of this Cold War, I couldn't take it anymore. The anxiety was a physical thing, a constant, tight knot in my chest. I felt like I was suffocating. I had to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it had to be better than this suffocating uncertainty. I went over to the apartment on a Thursday afternoon, my heart pounding with a nervous, frantic rhythm. I knew Mark had a lab that would last for 3 hours. I was engineering a confrontation, a prospect so terrifying that it made my hands tremble. I found Julian in the living room, ostensibly reading a textbook, but he was staring at the same page he'd been on when I arrived 10 minutes earlier. I stood in the middle of the room, my camera bag feeling like an anchor weighing me down. He hadn't acknowledged me beyond a clipped, "Hey, Julian," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Can we please talk?" He finally looked up from his book, his expression wary. "About what?" he asked, his tone defensive. "Don't do that," I said, my voice firmer now, fueled by a surge of desperate frustration. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. What happened last week?" On the couch, he flinched, his gaze dropping back to the page. He closed the book with a soft thud. "I was tired, Leo," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't thinking straight. It was a mistake. We should just forget about it, forget about it." The words were like a physical blow. He was trying to erase it, to invalidate the most significant moment of my life with 4 simple words. And suddenly, my heartbreak was eclipsed by a flash of anger. Not at him, but at the situation, at the fear that was making him do this. "A mistake?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what it was?" Because it didn't feel like a mistake to me. It felt real. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the street, his back to me once again. His shoulders were tense, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants. "Look, I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression," he said, his voice tight. I was confused. My head has been all over the place since the injury. "I'm not. I don't." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I don't like you like that. I'm not gay. I don't want you." I could hear all the sentences he was too cowardly to say, and the pain of it was so sharp, so acute, that it stole my breath. I had to end this. I had to give him the out he was so desperately fumbling for. "Right?" I said, my voice hollow. Confused. "I get it." I turned to leave, my movements stiff, robotic. I couldn't be in that room for another second. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I had my hand on the doorknob when his voice, small and broken, stopped me. "Don't go." I froze, my back still to him. I waited. I could hear him take a ragged breath. "I'm scared, Leo," he whispered. The admission was so quiet I almost missed it. It was a crack in the wall he had built, a tiny fissure of truth. I turned around slowly. He was still facing the window, but he had his forehead pressed against the cool glass, his good hand clenched into a fist at his side. He looked like a man on the verge of shattering. Scared of what? I asked, my voice gentle now, the anger gone, replaced by a wave of protective empathy. He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were filled with a torment that made my own pain seem insignificant. Of this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. Of what it means. I've never felt like this before. For anyone. And it doesn't make any sense. You're Mark's brother. You're my friend. I'm the guy who dates cheerleaders, you know? That's who I'm supposed to be. This whole thing, it terrifies me. And then I understood. His withdrawal wasn't about me. It wasn't about regretting the kiss. It was about him. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a version of himself he had never known existed, and he was terrified of the fall. He had spent his whole life swimming in clearly marked lanes, and now he was adrift in a vast, open ocean with no land in sight. His entire identity was being called into question, and it was happening at a time when he was already at his most vulnerable. The kiss hadn't been the mistake. The mistake, in his mind, was the feeling behind it. I walked slowly back into the room, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away. Hey, I said softly, waiting until he met my eyes. Look at me. He did, his gaze uncertain, fearful. There is nothing wrong with how you feel, I said, my voice full of a conviction I didn't know I possessed. It doesn't have to make sense right now. It doesn't have to have a label. It's just a feeling, and you don't have to be scared of it. At least, you don't have to be scared of it with me. A tear traced a path down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. But I am, he choked out. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Everything was so simple before, and now, nothing is. I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore, maybe, I said, taking another step closer. You're just finding out who you are. And maybe it's not the person you thought you were supposed to be. He just stared at me, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was a silence of raw, painful honesty. The walls were down. The pretense was gone. All that was left was his fear and my unwavering, terrifying hope. He searched my face, looking for what? Judgment? Repulsion? All he found was what had been there all along. A quiet, steady affection that was not going to be scared away by his confusion. He took a shaky step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of me. He looked down at the floor, then back up at me, his eyes pleading. I don't know what to do, he whispered. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had to be the anchor again. I had to be the solid ground. I reached out, not with the hesitant uncertainty of before, but with a new, quiet confidence. I placed my hands on his shoulders, my touch gentle but firm. You don't have to do anything, I said. You just have to breathe. We can just be. We don't have to figure it all out today. We can just start here. He let out a long, shuddering exhale, a sound of surrender. And then he collapsed against me, his arms wrapping around my back, his face burying itself in my shoulder. He held on to me as if I were the only thing keeping him from floating away, and I held him back just as tightly. It was not a hug of passion, but of desperation and relief. It was the hug of a man who had been lost at sea and had finally, miraculously, washed ashore. We stood there in the middle of the living room for a long time, holding each other up, two broken people finding a way to fit our pieces together. The conflict was not over, not by a long shot. But the war of silence had ended. We were finally speaking the same language. And it was a language of fear and confusion and the tentative, terrifying, beautiful beginnings of hope. The aftermath of that confrontation was not a sudden, cinematic resolution. There were no grand declarations, no immediate, easy slide into a new relationship. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. It was like developing a photograph, a delicate procedure that required patience and care, a careful balance of light and shadow. We had to create our own darkroom, a safe space where the image of whatever we were becoming could slowly emerge without being overexposed by the harsh light of expectation or fear. We started talking, really talking. Not just about his shoulder or my classes, but about everything. We talked about his fears, about the pressure he'd been under his whole life to be a certain kind of person, a certain kind of man. He admitted that his life before the injury, a life that had looked so perfect from the outside, had often felt hollow, a performance he was giving for an audience he didn't even know. He confessed that my quiet presence, my refusal to demand anything from him, had been the only thing that felt authentic in a world of superficial friendships. He told me that in the silence we shared, he felt like he could finally take off the mask, that he could just be Julian, the guy who was scared and tired and didn't have all the answers. And I talked too. I finally, haltingly, confessed the truth of my own feelings. I told him how long I had watched him from afar, how I had cataloged his smiles and his moods like a secret archivist. I even told him about the box of photographs under my bed. I expected him to be weirded out, to see me as some kind of creepy stalker. But he just listened, his expression soft and thoughtful. When I was finished, my confession hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Can I see them sometime?" The simple, accepting question was a gift, a validation of years of silent yearning. We reclaimed the couch. It happened one evening, about a week after our talk. We were watching a movie, sitting at opposite ends like we had been for weeks, a chasm of awkward space between us. About halfway through, Julian looked over at me, a question in his eyes. I gave him a small, encouraging nod. He shifted, slowly, tentatively, until he was sitting beside me. Not touching, not yet, but the distance was closed. It felt like a homecoming. A few minutes later, his hand found mine on the cushion between us, his fingers lacing through my own. His hand was warm and strong. We sat like that for the rest of the movie, our hands clasped together, a silent, powerful statement. We were rewriting the rules of our ritual. It was no longer about a pretext, no longer cloaked in plausible deniability. It was intentional. It was real. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was imbued with a new honesty. When he rested his head on my shoulder, it was not because he needed support for his injury, but because he wanted to be close to me. When I put my arm around him, it was not the hesitant, fearful gesture of before, but a clear, unambiguous act of affection. We were learning a new choreography, a dance for two people who were finally admitting they wanted to be on the same dance floor. The first time he kissed me again, it was in the kitchen while I was making tea. He had come up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Thank you," he'd whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "For what?" I'd asked. "For not giving up on me," he'd replied. And then he had turned me around and kissed me, slowly and deeply, a kiss that was not a question, but an answer. A kiss that tasted of mint tea and certainty. Our new normal was quiet. It was domestic. It was made up of 1,000 small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary. It was me helping him with his physical therapy exercises, my hands gentle on his healing shoulder. It was him looking at my photographs, really looking at them, and pointing to a blurry figure in the background of a campus shot, and saying, with a soft smile, "I remember that day. I was wondering why you were pointing your camera at that tree. It was falling asleep on the couch, not by accident, but on purpose, tangled together under a shared blanket, because neither of us wanted to be in our own beds, alone." Mark, my brother, eventually figured it out. He never said anything directly. He just started finding more reasons to be out of the apartment on weekends. One day, he clapped me on the shoulder, a knowing, affectionate look in his eye. "I'm glad he has you, Leo," he said. And that was all that needed to be said. The resolution was not a single event, but a slow, dawning realization. The peace we found was not in defining what we were, but in the simple act of being together. We had navigated the terrifying, uncharted waters of our own feelings and had found a new shore, a place that felt like home. The fear had not vanished entirely, not for Julian, but it was no longer a roaring monster. It was a small, quiet thing that he could acknowledge and then set aside, because the feeling of being with me, the safety and acceptance he found in my presence, was stronger. He was still healing, both physically and emotionally, but he was no longer doing it alone. One evening, months after that first, hesitant kiss, we were lying on the couch in our usual position, my arm around him, his head on my chest. A quiet, ambient album was playing on the stereo. His shoulder was almost completely healed, the sling a distant memory. He no longer needed me as a physical support. He was just there because he wanted to be. He reached up and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine and resting our joined hands on his chest, right over his heart. "You know," he said, his voice a low, comfortable murmur. For the longest time, I thought my life was a straight line. From the starting block to the wall. That's all I saw. I never thought about what would happen if I got knocked out of my lane. He tilted his head back to look at me, his eyes clear and full of a deep, quiet emotion that made my own heart ache with a fierce, protective love. "You're what happened," he said. "You were this whole other place I didn't even know existed. And it's better than any race I've ever won." I tightened my grip on his hand, my throat thick. I didn't need to say anything. He knew. He could feel it in my touch, see it in my eyes. We had built our own language, a language of quiet gestures and shared silences that was more eloquent than any words could ever be. The boy I had fallen in love with, the bright, distant star, was gone. In his place was this man, this beautiful, vulnerable, strong man who had let me see all of his broken pieces, and who had trusted me to help him put them back together. And in healing him, I had healed myself. The lonely observer had stepped out from behind the camera and into the frame. I was no longer just documenting life. I was living it. We build our lives out of moments, stacking them one on top of the other like stones, creating a structure that we hope will shelter us. We think we are the sole architects of this construction, that we are following a clear and deliberate blueprint. But sometimes another person comes along and, with a single, unintentional gesture, places a stone in a way we never would have considered. They reveal a window where we thought there was a wall, or an open door where we had only ever seen a dead end. They change the architecture of our world. Julian had stumbled into my carefully ordered, solitary life and, in his own brokenness, had inadvertently shown me how to build something far more beautiful than I could have ever designed on my own. It was a structure built not of wood and plaster, but of trust and vulnerability. It was a quiet, unassuming place, but the light that fell through its windows was warmer than any sun I had ever known. We had found our way out of the loneliness, not by leaving our rooms, but by learning how to share them. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we finally began to feel at home.